Most individuals envision the time of Jesus as a purely spiritual era. Sandals, sermons, miracles, these images dominate their understanding. However, for those who lived during that period, daily existence was dictated not by theology but by economics. More specifically, it revolved around the lack of money. The world into which the historical figure of Jesus was born was shaped by one of the most unequal economic systems ever seen in the ancient Mediterranean region. Welcome to a narrative where finance, power, and history intersect dramatically, where nothing is ever as straightforward as it appears. In the early 1st century, Judea found itself within the boundaries of the Roman Empire, an unparalleled apparatus for extracting wealth that the world had never witnessed before. Rome did not conquer lands with the intention of integrating them. Rather, it sought to subjugate them to finance its own center. Provinces existed primarily to funnel wealth outward: grain, silver, labor, from the periphery of the empire to Rome itself. Judea stood firmly among those peripheries. A single disastrous season could plunge a farming family into a vicious cycle of debt from which they might never escape. This was a common tragedy in rural communities. A farmer would plant his crops with hope, but then unpredictable weather patterns would devastate his harvest. Despite this loss, taxes remained due and payable without fail. In desperation, the farmer might turn to a local lender, a wealthy landowner or influential figure connected to religious institutions, for help. As interest piled up on these loans, the following year might bring only a meager recovery of crops. Yet the debt remained unchanged and relentless. Eventually, if the situation did not improve, the farmer faced the grim reality of losing his land entirely. What was once a thriving homestead could become merely a rented plot under someone else's control. In worse scenarios, he could find himself reduced to laboring for others or even vanishing altogether from the landscape he once called home. This pattern was not merely coincidental. It was indicative of systemic issues within society. Over time, land ownership increasingly consolidated among a select few individuals. Small plots gave way to expansive estates owned by elite families who had close ties to Roman authority and temple administration. Meanwhile, vast numbers of people found themselves trapped in cycles of instability and despair. The economy not only fostered poverty, it actively reproduced it through its exploitative mechanisms. There was no social safety net provided by the government for those who lost their land. Unemployment benefits were non-existent. Social welfare programs failed to materialize, leaving families without support when calamity struck. The only refuge available lay within extended family networks, which were increasingly strained under economic pressures. While charitable efforts existed within communities, their reach was limited. When too many individuals fell into hardship simultaneously, existing systems proved inadequate to offer any real assistance or relief from suffering. Debt transcended mere financial ramifications. It morphed into a profound social burden as well. Losing one's land equated to losing status in society. Security was stripped away along with identity itself. A family's future hung precariously in balance, subject to whims such as droughts or rising tax demands, or simply an unpaid loan that spiraled out of control. It is crucial to emphasize that the majority of people living in these conditions were not impoverished due to laziness or moral failing. Rather, they were ensnared by a system that mandated their suffering and subjugation. Rome demanded excess wealth from its provinces, while local elites clamored for rental income and temple authorities sought revenue streams. This relentless pressure fell disproportionately on those least able to withstand such burdens, ordinary farmers and laborers who had little margin for error. This environment fostered tension rather than tranquility throughout Judea. Instability reigned supreme as uprisings erupted with alarming frequency. Criminal activities like banditry emerged not just as acts of lawlessness but as desperate responses born from economic despair. Groups began forming around promises of aid and calls for justice. Movements advocating change emerged amidst widespread crises, rather than from positions of comfort or security. This situation was significant because Judea was not affluent. It was predominantly rural and agricultural and marked by fragility. The majority of its inhabitants relied on farming for their survival. Yet these were not farms in today's sense. They were small plots barely sufficient for subsistence. A poor harvest did not simply result in decreased profits. it meant famine. And Rome remained indifferent to such suffering. Herein lies an aspect frequently overlooked by contemporary observers. The socio-political landscape was fraught with turmoil and discontent, setting the stage for significant transformations and upheavals that would shape history in profound ways. When individuals listened to sermons about debt forgiveness, liberation from financial burdens, fairness, and cancellation, they were not merely hearing metaphors. They were receiving messages about their very survival in an economic landscape fraught with challenges. When discussions arose regarding the impoverished, it was not just a matter of abstract compassion. These were their neighbors, their families, and often, it was even themselves grappling with financial strain. In this context, terms like forgiveness transcended mere emotional relief. They represented the actual annulment of debts. It symbolized a fresh start, a means of escape from an all-consuming cycle of financial despair, a rare opportunity in a tightly controlled system. The Roman framework that governed Judea prioritized efficiency over humanity, meticulously extracting wealth from the lower classes while maintaining order at any cost. Suffering was tolerated as long as societal stability remained intact. In this hierarchy, maintaining order took precedence over achieving justice, and generating income outweighed the value of individual lives. This relentless pursuit of stability left many in Judea feeling suffocated under the weight of their circumstances. Individuals toiled harder than ever yet found themselves falling further behind in an unforgiving economy where productivity did not equate to security. Economic growth benefited only a select few while many others sank deeper into hardship. Although the system functioned effectively on the surface, it failed to rejuvenate or recover from its own inequities. Crucially, everyone recognized this truth. There existed no illusions about the fairness of the prevailing system. Belief in hard work as a pathway to safety had long since eroded. All that remained was sheer endurance and simmering resentment among the masses, coupled with a flicker of hope that something, anything, might disrupt this vicious cycle. This very hope is what renders certain ideas perilous because within such a rigid structure, even minor shifts can appear revolutionary. Even words wield significant power to destabilize entrenched norms. By the time Jesus began his public ministry, the economic pressures felt by the people had reached a breaking point. The audience was primed for change. Cracks in their reality were becoming increasingly visible. Anger simmered beneath the surface while despair became a rational response to their plight. It was not mere backdrop, but rather a driving force urging for transformation. To truly comprehend why Judea's economy seemed insurmountable, one must examine the institution believed to provide them protection, the Temple in Jerusalem. In contemporary thought, many envision this sacred site primarily as a place for worship, a venue for prayer, sacrifices, and spiritual authority. However, economically speaking, the Temple stood as one of the most formidable financial institutions within the region. It played an integral role beyond merely shaping faith. It facilitated substantial monetary transactions and held considerable influence over financial matters. The temple operated at multiple levels, on one hand serving as a sacred space where believers felt God's presence, on another hand functioning as a treasury akin to a bank or tax office while also acting as a court for legal disputes. These roles were intricately intertwined and could not be separated from one another. Every adult male Jew was mandated to contribute an annual temple tax. This obligation was neither optional nor symbolic. It was enforceable and firmly established within their societal framework. Thus, while some may have viewed these contributions solely through a religious lens, they were also acutely aware of their economic implications and responsibilities tied to them. Such dynamics rendered individuals caught in an unyielding web of fiscal expectations where spirituality and finance converged dramatically, a truth that amplified the urgency for change within Judean society amidst such oppressive conditions. Rome governed Judea through a combination of local elites and imperial officials. Kings like Herod the Great ruled with Rome's approval. Following his death, Roman prefects took charge of the region. Figures like Pontius Pilate, whose primary responsibilities did not include enhancing living standards but rather maintaining order and ensuring a steady flow of revenue to the empire. Taxes formed the foundation upon which this system operated. The tax was to be paid in a specific silver coin known as the Tyrian shekel, renowned for its consistent silver content. Local currencies were not accepted, nor were Roman coins, which meant that individuals had to exchange their money to fulfill their religious obligations. This task fell to money changers who did not perform this service for free. Their operations included exchange fees, adding another layer of cost for pilgrims journeying to Jerusalem during the festivals. These travelers often found themselves compelled to convert their own currencies into the required form of payment. Meanwhile, merchants offered animals for sacrifice, such as doves, lambs, and cattle, at prices sanctioned by the temple authorities. If one was impoverished, escaping this system was nearly impossible. Although poorer individuals could contribute smaller donations, they were still expected to pay something. Thus, religion did not replace the existing Roman tax burden. It merely compounded it. Herein lies a significant contradiction. The elite of the temple were deeply intertwined with Roman authority. The high priests were not chosen based on popular support or spiritual merit, but rather appointed with Rome's approval. Stability took precedence over righteousness, and collaboration with the occupying power outweighed any sense of justice. Consequently, an institution that claimed moral authority over the populace simultaneously profited from the same exploitative dynamics that impoverished them. This created a profound yet subtle dissonance. The temple preached messages of holiness, forgiveness, and righteousness while simultaneously reinforcing cycles of debt and inequality among its followers. Access to God came at a price. Purity demanded offerings. Forgiveness required sacrifices, and every sacrifice necessitated financial resources. For those without means, reliance on charity became essential. Yet this philanthropy was often erratic and inconsistent. It could not withstand systemic pressures nor compensate for land loss or erase debts entirely. Charity treated symptoms rather than addressing root causes, and people became increasingly aware of this disparity. As the first century progressed, discontent towards the temple authorities became widespread among various segments of society. This unrest was not born out of a rejection of faith itself, but rather an acute awareness of hypocrisy within the institution. The very establishment tasked with mediating between God and the people appeared more like an additional instrument of elite control than a genuine spiritual guide. This context is crucial because Jesus did not operate outside this intricate web. He spoke directly into it. When he addressed issues of debt forgiveness, his audience understood these ideas through an economic lens that resonated deeply with their lived experiences. His calls for liberation were heard as invitations to relief from burdensome obligations. When he spoke about the poor, his listeners did not envision distant cases of charity. They envisioned their own struggles and aspirations reflected in his words. Furthermore, when Jesus proclaimed the coming kingdom of God, he was not communicating abstract theological concepts, but rather articulating a vision that held tangible implications for their daily lives and socio-economic realities. His message challenged prevailing structures and resonated with those longing for change amidst systemic oppression. In essence, Jesus' teachings ignited hope within those who felt marginalized by both religious institutions and imperial governance. His radical approach invited people into a new understanding of community and divine relationship, one where compassion surpassed mere transactional exchanges and where everyone could envision themselves as partakers in a transformative vision of justice and equity. They envisioned an alternative order, one in which the prevailing system was not considered absolute. This is why the weight of his words resonated deeply. However, mere words alone could not pose a significant threat to established authorities. True disruption came from actions and behaviors. Jesus did not launch a direct attack on Rome, which would have resulted in a swift and decisive end to his influence. Instead, he subtly undermined the very foundations of legitimacy itself. He redefined values and challenged the notions of who deserved authority and why they merited it at all. His teachings were crafted in such a way that they eroded the moral principles supporting both Roman governance and the complicity of the temple authorities. This is precisely why economic language permeated his messages so thoroughly. Terms like debt, wages, laborers, vineyards, creditors, stewards, masters, and servants were not mere random metaphors but rather reflections of everyday realities. Herein lies a critical complexity. In contemporary society, taxes are often perceived as something levied on income or profits generated from growth. However, in Judea, taxes were obligatory regardless of one's financial outcome. Citizens paid simply because they existed. There were land taxes, product taxes, head taxes, tolls on roads and marketplaces, all compounded by religious levies imposed atop imperial ones. Missing a payment brought immediate repercussions. These concepts illuminated social inequalities that many had grown accustomed to ignoring. Then came a pivotal moment that altered everything, the dramatic event at the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of money changers, it was far more than just an act of religious defiance. It represented a profound economic confrontation. His ire was not directed at prayer itself, but at the system that commodified access to the sacred. He referred to this space as a den of robbers, not merely because it contained money, but because profit-seeking had supplanted justice itself. This transgression crossed a critical line. The Roman Empire could tolerate prophets and teachers who critiqued its structure but could never accept instability within its borders. The temple authorities understood well that unrest during Passover, a time when Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims, was particularly perilous. A combination of crowds and discontent could easily lead to rebellion. From their perspective, Jesus was not merely preaching. He was disrupting vital economic flows and challenging established legitimacy. He threatened to destabilize the carefully maintained balance that kept them in power while satisfying Roman interests. This is where the crux of conflict lay. Not merely theological debates but profound economic and political struggles. The system could endure suffering. It could withstand inequality. However, what Rome could not tolerate was a narrative that prompted people to question the necessity of suffering itself. For once individuals began to see debt as less an inevitable fate and more as an unjust construct, coercive collection methods became increasingly difficult to enforce. By this point, Judea had transformed into a pressure cooker filled with tensions. Rising taxes, loss of land ownership, overwhelming debts, religious obligations piled upon one another, combined with political oppression. All these factors converged into an explosive situation ripe for revolt. An uprising ceased to be a question of if, but rather when. In response to this mounting pressure, Rome reacted predictably, as it always had throughout its history. What transpired following Jesus' actions did not signify the collapse of their system. Instead, it led to its intensification. Within a generation span, Judea erupted into full-scale rebellion against Roman rule in 66 CE. The events surrounding this insurrection marked a significant turning point, one which would reshape both Judean society and its relationship with imperial power forevermore. By the year 70, Jerusalem faced a devastating siege. The Temple, which stood as the heart of Jewish economic, religious, and political life, fell into ruin, dismantled brick by brick. Its treasury was plundered mercilessly, and the hierarchy of priests who once guided the spiritual lives of the people was obliterated. Hundreds of thousands of individuals were either slain or forcibly displaced from their homes. The Roman Empire did not merely stifle dissent. It systematically dismantled the very infrastructure that had allowed resistance to flourish. Following this destruction, Rome reasserted its dominance on its own terms, a critical nuance often overlooked in historical narratives. The devastation of the temple did not signal an end to economic exploitation. Rather, it simplified and intensified it. The mechanisms of Roman taxation grew more oppressive and pervasive, leading to an accelerated consolidation of land ownership. Debts did not vanish. Instead, they transformed into a more insidious form, less visible yet more bureaucratic and absolute in nature. The old moral framework crumbled under pressure, but the material burdens remained as heavy as before. In the short term, Rome achieved a decisive victory swiftly and ruthlessly, but seizing territorial control does not equate to achieving mastery over meaning itself. Jesus did not lead an army, nor did he propose new tax reforms or a redistribution of land ownership. He made no attempts to supplant Roman governance with an alternative state apparatus. This is precisely why his influence cannot be gauged through mere regime change. Instead of challenging Rome's capacity for exploitation directly, he questioned the moral logic that rendered such exploitation acceptable and divinely sanctioned. By undermining the idea that debt was a reflection of personal moral failure and advocating for forgiveness outside institutional frameworks, Jesus shifted focus onto the impoverished as pivotal figures rather than mere outcasts. There was no tax authority nor any formal process for appeals against taxation decisions. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors known as tax farmers, who would pay Rome upfront for the right to collect taxes, and then extracted every possible cent from their fellow countrymen to cover their costs and secure a profit for themselves. Such exploitation was not merely an aberration, it served as an incentive to maximize collections. More significant than legions was the issue of legitimacy itself. Empires can endure suffering. However, they face profound challenges when their citizens lose faith in the notion that suffering is a necessary cost for order and stability. After the temple's downfall, the system critiqued by Jesus did not vanish. Instead, his critique persisted in different forms. In subsequent decades, small communities emerged that operated under alternative principles, sharing resources among one another, offering mutual aid during hardships, and forgiving debts within their circles. Their loyalty was grounded in faith rather than land ownership, lineage, or social status, a radical shift from existing norms. These movements were not revolutions in a traditional sense. Rather, they presented parallel logics that provided alternative ways of living within an empire that exerted control over many aspects of life without fully encompassing these new moral economies. Rome efficiently suppressed armed insurrections whenever they arose. It had always done so with ruthless efficiency. Yet this particular challenge proved far more complex to extinguish because it did not require physical territory or financial resources to sustain itself. It flowed alongside people's lives and thrived under pressure. It endured through loss and hardship while nurturing resilience among those who sought alternatives to imperial rule. In essence, what transpired in those turbulent times illustrated how ideas could spread quietly yet powerfully beneath layers of oppression, transforming hearts and minds even amidst dire circumstances, and ultimately laying foundations for new systems rooted in solidarity and shared humanity against an overwhelming backdrop of imperial authority. Over time, an unexpected transformation occurred. Rome never fully regained control over the narratives people created about power, debts, and legitimacy. By the 4th century, the empire had not eradicated this alternative moral framework. Rather, it absorbed it into its own fabric. In doing so, those in power quietly acknowledged a profound truth. Their authority could no longer rely solely on brute strength. Moral legitimacy became a crucial factor, even for those wielding power. The economic landscape during the era of Jesus reveals something unsettling. Systems do not collapse merely due to inherent injustice or unfairness. They crumble when the justifications that uphold them cease to resonate with the populace. Rome excelled at resource extraction and optimization, yet it failed to restore the moral barrier that rendered its dominance both natural and acceptable in the eyes of its subjects. This illustrates a deeper lesson about governance and societal structures. Economic systems imbued with a moral narrative tend to possess remarkable resilience. They endure hardships and grievances, whether revolts and discontent. However, they cannot withstand widespread disbelief, that pivotal moment when individuals stop viewing their suffering as inevitable, deserved, or meaningful. History does not simply repeat itself. Rather, it reveals patterns that help us understand recurring themes across time. Once you recognize how power protects itself through more than mere force but also through compelling stories and narratives, it becomes increasingly challenging to dismiss these tales as mere coincidence. The interplay between authority and storytelling is intricate and vital to understanding societal dynamics. In this light, history serves as a repository of insights waiting to be uncovered, if one knows where to look. The exploration of these patterns can illuminate our current realities and provide guidance as we navigate complex social landscapes. Understanding these dynamics can empower individuals to critically assess authority and its narratives in contemporary society. For those unable to meet their tax obligations, borrowing became commonplace, a desperate measure taken out of sheer necessity. Debt permeated society like an insidious fog that enveloped all aspects of life in Judea during this tumultuous period. As people struggled under these burdensome conditions, communities began devising ways to cope with their economic reality, while also seeking hope and purpose beyond mere survival amidst relentless taxation pressures and oppressive governance. Such complexities shaped a milieu where spirituality intertwined intricately with everyday struggles, setting the stage for transformative ideas that would later emerge from this turbulent historical backdrop. In summary, far from being solely about miracles and divine teachings, This era encapsulated profound human experiences marked by hardship and resilience within an intricate web of power dynamics that continue to resonate through history even today. Unlike the modern concept of debt, which often includes safety nets, the financial obligations of past societies were devoid of such protections. There were no options for bankruptcy or restructuring to alleviate burdens. Interest accumulated rapidly, creating an overwhelming weight that many could not bear. The land itself often served as collateral, putting families at risk of losing everything at the drop of a hat.